Hey there, Herle Burlyites. I have a quick quiz for you. What do Crofton, Puntledge, Lumbee, Fairwinds, Selmo, and Telqua have in common? If you guessed that they're all delicious artisanal Canadian cheeses, you're wrong. 0 points. If you guessed that they're all small communities in BC, you get 5 points. And if you guessed that they're small communities in BC that are now enjoying high-speed digital connectivity, you get 10 points. As of last month, our presenting sponsor, TELUS, has connected every single community in British Columbia with 1,000 people or more to their award-winning 4G LTE wireless network. It's a huge milestone, and it's in addition to the many smaller communities with fewer than 1,000 residents that TELUS has connected. We hear so much about rural connectivity and making technology more accessible for all Canadians. And TELUS is leading the way, bringing their world-class network to rural and remote parts of Canada, building new cell towers and connecting communities with their leading pure fiber technology. Here's a remarkable stat. UK-based Open Signal recently found that if rural Canada was its own country, and some days it wants to be, it would rank number 12 in the world for wireless download speeds. That means rural Canadians, on average, get faster speeds than, get this, the US, New Zealand, Sweden, and France. That's the result of billions of dollars of investment that TELUS is making in communities big and small to improve the lives of Canadians and ensure that everyone is all connected for good. To learn more, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, here we are with the show, and I got to start off by saying in the spring of 2013, the most serendipitous event occurred to me. I was walking down King Street, minding my own business, when I took a call from Andrew Bevan. He asked me if I would help out Kathleen Wynne, the new leader. It was totally unexpected. I had never been seriously involved in the Ontario Liberal Party, nor had I ever met Kathleen Wynne. That call changed my life in so many great ways. Kathleen Wynne drives the cynicism right out of you. She makes you remember why you got into politics. She reconnects you with your idealism. It was the pleasure of my life to have tagged along on her journey. I learned so much. I had never worked for anybody like her before, as in a woman. She showed me different ways of looking at things, of reacting to things, and of doing things, even politics.
You were pretty sheltered, weren't you?
I was pretty sheltered. I was so proud to watch her govern and to drag liberalism kicking and screaming into the modern realities of life for most people. Kathleen Wynne. She's the real deal, and she's sitting here in the Orange Lounge with me for what promises to be a real grilling.
I'm shaking here.
Exactly. Kathleen, thank you for coming in to do this.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, David.
Just a few ground rules. First of all,
no swearing.
We do try to laugh on this show, and, even gallows humor is acceptable, so a little laughter is good. And the second thing is, swearing is fine because we're not on network television, and people may be surprised to note that you do that from time to time. So if the situation arises, I got to start off by saying, Kathleen, that we are in 2 days from this conversation. Will be the first day of the Ontario Liberal Party Leadership Convention to select a new leader, and Friday night will be a tribute to you on the behalf of the party. You'll be speaking at that event. What kind of emotions are you feeling right now?
Yeah, it is. I have very mixed emotions.
Right.
It will be a really bittersweet night. On one level, David, I just want to go and not to be centered out and just to be there as part of the team, right? But I also know that there are a lot of people who want us to come together and have some, I'm going to use that overused word, closure, and then move forward. A reporter asked me yesterday what my speech was going to be about on Friday, and was I going to go over the mistakes that we made and all of the things that went wrong? And I said, no, I'm not going to do that because we had a provincial council right after the election. We've had many, many conversations, different people in the party. Tomorrow or Friday and Saturday are about moving forward. They're about looking at what comes next and putting ourselves in a position that we can bring a progressive vision to the province. So I'm looking forward to it because there will be a lot of people there who I love, and I'm also kind of dreading it because it's going to be very emotional.
Yeah, the Friday night will be.
It's going to be very.
The Friday
emotional.
night will be very emotional.
Yeah.
And it's weird to sit there and watch a tribute to yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't done it yet, but it makes me feel slightly ill.
It's got to be a bit like attending your own funeral or something that, right?
That's right. That's right. The news of my demise.
It's the only time people are that unabashedly positive about anybody in politics.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't really know what that's going to feel like. But I really want it to feel like we're all in it together and we're celebrating what we've done together, and that can propel us into the next phase. It was painful what we went through, right?
Yes.
It was painful.
Yes. June
18 was a really hard event, and the year or so running up to it was really hard. So so I'm hoping that Friday night won't in any way bring people down, that it will be uplifting, and that we can just soar into Saturday.
What I'm looking forward to about Friday night is the fact that June 18 doesn't define you and your time in public life. Right. That I think it's important to provide some context to June 18.
Yeah.
Right. And that's hopefully what Friday night.
Well, and this last year and a half or so, has been about me being in lots of different places, talking to people, particularly young people, and they have all sorts of questions that are about how I got into politics, why I got into politics, the things that we did, and June 18th.
Those are the same questions I have.
June 18th hardly comes up.
Right.
They wanna ask me policy questions, and so I've spent a lot of time in those kinds of environments in the last year and a half, and so that it feels like that has helped me to heal a bit from the really awful political.
Do you have a place to put it? Where do you put it? I haven't put it anywhere yet.
The awful.
Yeah.
No, I mean it comes up unbidden. I can wake up in the middle of the night and just feel so bleak. And you and I have talked about this. I mean, the bleakness for me is a sense of letting people down, that
compounded by who we lost to.
Well, yeah.
Right? It is. I mean,
well, if the last year and a half or so has been great in the sense that I've had the opportunity to talk to all those people that I just mentioned and talk about what we did, it's been really tough because we're watching what's going on in the province, and the ineptitude is just frightening.
Right.
So that does compound the bleakness of losing. Right. But I don't know where I put it. I don't think it will ever totally go away. I think it's, you go through your life and there are touchstone events that happen that are really, really vivid. That week before the election, when I stood in that playground and said to people that I wasn't going to be the premier, and that I will never forget that. I will never forget the feeling of doing that. I'll never forget those kids in the playground, and I'll never forget the sense that that was the beginning of letting people down. It was awful. It was awful.
Yeah. Well, nobody's ever had to go through that before in a campaign, and it was stunningly courageous of you to do that. I remember getting a call from Paul Martin, who was on the bus with you.
We were on the bus together the night before.
And he had seen what you were going to say, and he called me, and he lit into me, like, how can you make that person do that? Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Surely you wouldn't have done that to me. And I would have done the same advice to him. Whether or not he'd have taken it or not is a different matter. It was very courageous advice to take.
He was great, because I think it was the night before, wasn't it? We were on the bus together. We'd been in Brampton or something. And he'd spoken at the rally, and sitting on the bus, he was just so supportive, just his presence. And he was the person in the bus that I thought, you really do know what I'm feeling right now,
Right.
So it was incredibly helpful to have him there, even though we didn't go through the speech or talk about it or anything, but he knew what was going on. It was really helpful.
He compartmentalizes these things completely. He and I have never discussed the 2006 defeat. Never once.
Really?
Never exchanged words about it. He won't talk about it. It's just gone. It's sealed up in a vault and gone.
Wow.
No, it's obviously not gone.
No.
Right?
No.
But it's the way different people deal with these
Yeah,
things.
I don't know how to do that. It's all of a piece for me. It's part of the story, and it's part of my story, and there are way more good things about my life in politics than that. But it's a big piece.
Although I may never have felt closer to you than that night where we had to make that decision about what to do. So let's take a step back and go ask some of those questions that those kids were asking you, which is I think a lot of liberals, active liberals, know your origin story, but probably not a lot of people do. So what?
My origin story.
Well, your origin story. What got you involved in elected politics? What made you take the leap from interested, involved citizen to I'm going to run for office?
Well, it was a sort of a two-step process, because I was so this is the 1990s. I'm living in North Toronto. My kid's dad and I moved back from Holland in 1982. I had 2 kids then. I had a third. So by the 1990s, I was, I'd finished my master's degree in education, and I was working part-time, and I had these 3 kids, and I was really interested in education. I mean, that was my field, and I was getting involved with the school board at the time and serving on committees and being involved with the kids' school council. And I thought, 1994, I thought, I think I could take a run at school trustee. Mm-hmm. And so Jane and I put together a campaign. We couldn't get anybody to be a campaign manager for us. We tried a few people. We tried a couple of liberals.
Right.
And one guy said to Jane, so is she a liberal? And Jane said, well, she's not a card carrying anything. This is 1994. He said, well, I'd run a campaign for a Labrador if she was a liberal, but if she's not a liberal, I'm not going to do it. So we couldn't find anybody to do it. And so we did it. We just did it. Jane put maps on the wall, and I figured if I walk along those streets and knock on those doors, like how complicated can this be? Anyway, we lost by 72 votes to a longtime incumbent. It was a great experience. I just loved it. And I thought, I may do this again. But it was very much because I'm interested in the Toronto board, and I want to see if I can make some changes around arts education and equity education. I had come out in 1990, so Jane and I were still navigating the homophobia of North Toronto. And so it was all very much sort of a next step in my being a community person. And then in 1995...
Have you spent a lot of time in your life in front of things before? Like there's a big difference between people that say, I'm happy to be part of this movement, I want to support this movement, and people who say, I want to lead this movement, I want to be at the forefront of it.
So, yeah, I mean, I can trace that back, that wanting to, it's not the wanting to be in charge, it's just the, okay, I think this is how we should do it, and so let's do it this way. When I was 16, I was sent away to camp. I was chosen to go to what then was called OALC, Ontario Athletic Leadership Camp. Okay. And one kid in grade 11 across the province, so this was about 1968, 69, one kid in every grade 11 class in every high school in Ontario was chosen to go to the Ontario Athletic Leadership Camp. And basically, it was a training ground for phys ed teachers. Like they wanted us all to be phys ed teachers. The reason I'm telling you this story is I remember my phys ed teacher, who was very important to me throughout my high school career. She was my track coach. She read, when I graduated, she read the report from that camp when I was in grade 11. And it basically said, this girl leads from the middle. You know, she understands how to organize people to get them to do things, and she doesn't stand at the front, she stands in the middle. And that stuck with me. Right. It stuck with me as a good thing. I was really proud of that, you know, that was how I had been perceived. And again, that was a touchstone moment for me, and it has informed my leadership style. So it started very young. I mean, it started when I was little. I'm the eldest of 4 girls. I had a very sick sister. My mom was overwhelmed with these 3 kids under 4, and I had a lot of responsibility. So, being, I don't want to say being in charge, but getting things organized was part of what I did. Yeah. 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 And if there's nobody, if there's nobody who's going to say, okay, now this is what we're going to do next, I'm always going to step into that space. And so that started really early.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I'm asking you is because quite regularly on this show, I and others bemoan the shrinkage of the number of really high quality people that seem to be seeking leadership, especially in politics and public life these days, and how it's a devalued thing. And people are more likely to want to continue to make money in the private sector or do something than to come into it. So I am interested in what made somebody like you say, I could lend my support to these things, or I am going to be the person that makes this happen, right? It's a particular mindset, and an important mindset, but a rarer one, I think, these days.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I used to say to my kids, because we'd talk about politics, and I used to say to them, you know, some people have a musical gift, and some people have the gift of being gregarious and wanting to guide something, you know? I mean, it feels to me like it was just part of who I was. And the reason I go back to that grade 11 thing is that it wasn't conscious. It's not conscious when you're 14, 13. I certainly wasn't thinking, well, I'm going to be the leader, or I'm going to be the captain, or I'm the best, because I wasn't the best. I wasn't the best athlete. I wasn't the best scholar. I was good enough at all those things, but I was able to organize people. We organized the little walkout on, you know, the fact that girls couldn't wear pants to school. It was my mom and I who wrote the notes, and we approached the board about girls being able to wear pants to school in 1966. So it just was part of how I understood my role, which was to, okay, if there's nobody here who's going to do this, then I'm going to figure out a way to do it.
Okay. What are some politicians or public figures that inspired you?
Well, when I was growing up, Trudeau was.
I know that I would not have been involved in politics were it not for Pierre Trudeau.
Right.
Absolutely the catalyst for my involvement.
Right. And, you know, Trudeau was beloved in my family. We lived in a pretty conservative part of the province.
I'm from Saskatchewan.
You are, yeah. I should talk. Trudeau was...
a tough part of Ontario for the Trudeaus, different than Saskatchewan.
But Pearson, too, you know. Pearson was... We looked up to him. I get my notion of Canada as the peacemaker in the world, you know. So I think those people were... From my kind of liberal sensibility, they were really important to me. There were local women who were involved in, on a very micro level.
Right.
There were people in my community who were pretty strong women. There were a few town councillors and people who took the reins of authority in a way that helped me. I mean, there was a woman named Lois Hansey who was a real force of nature in Richmond Hill, and she was mouthy, and she's still going strong, you know. And I remember thinking, okay, I really admire that. You know, I admire that she speaks out. And remember, this was a long time ago, so it wasn't necessarily easy for somebody like that. And my own grandmother was, both my mom and my grandmother were basically orphaned by the time they were little kids, and when they were still little kids, and they both made their way. You know, mom was a singer, grandma was a teacher, and they made their way in the world. So there was no question in our family that a woman couldn't make her way and be whatever she wanted to be. That was kind of an understood.
Did your mom agree with your politics later in life?
Not always.
Because she sounds like she might have been a bootstrapper.
She was a dipper, you know. She was a dipper. She would vote.
I see. Okay,
She would vote NDP. She didn't always tell us when she was doing that, but she did. You know, she loved Stephen Lewis, and we all love Stephen Lewis. But she was definitely on the rebellious side of the political spectrum. The rest of the family was liberal.
You had 3 books in your portrait. There's 3 books on your desk. Who wrote them?
Well, there was a biography of Trudeau, and there was a book on lesbian parenting. Catherine Arnott edited that, and actually Jane and I contributed to that. And then actually there were a couple more. There was a book on the Pan-Parapan Games from 2015, and there was a book of pictures from Kenora, from northwestern Ontario, and a book of the history of Richmond Hill. So I was trying to locate myself in that portrait.
Right, which you did beautifully. We need to take a small break
for
a word from our sponsor.
Okay.
And this will be kind of amusing in a way, perhaps. February 27th, 2020 was a historic day for Ontario's 80,000 realtors. On February 27th, the Trust in Real Estate Services Act, or Tressa, passed the third and final vote in the Ontario Legislature with all-party support. Having Tressa become law is a huge win for realtors, their clients, and hardworking Ontario families. It means that Ontario homebuyers and sellers can have greater confidence that the realtor at their side during the largest financial transaction of their life has the highest professional standards, training, and modern tools in North America, including the ability to form personal real estate corporations. OREA has been advocating for updated real estate legislation for close to 2 decades. We want to thank Premier Doug Ford and Minister Lisa Thompson for making this dream a reality, and MPPs Tom Rakocevic and Mike Schreiner for lending their support to the bill as well. So there you go.
There you go.
Premier, it's a living. Coming back to...
I won't comment on the policy.
coming back to where we were. So that's a little bit of why you got into politics.
Well, I didn't... Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm being long-winded here because what got me into party politics and what got me thinking about running provincially was that after that 1994 defeat for the school board run, Mike Harris was elected in Ontario. And that really was... That was the catalyst because as far as I was concerned, he was breaking the social contract that we had on public services, you know, that had been in place for decades. I mean, Bill Davis was the Minister of Education when I was graduating from school and, you know, and then he was the Premier. And that was my understanding of what a progressive conservative was. He was my understanding of a progressive conservative. Mike Harris was not my understanding of a progressive conservative. And so as he started to take a sledgehammer to education in particular, but then the relationship between the province and municipalities, you know, the forced amalgamations, I just felt that I really needed to be part of a movement that was going to push back against this. I contacted John Sewell, who was the former mayor of Toronto. He and I were doing similar things in our communities, trying to organize people against what Mike Harris was doing. And so that was really what got me involved in provincial politics.
And, I mean, the legacy of Harris is with us still, isn't it? I mean,
Absolutely.
It haunted you through your whole premiership. I mean, it's the reason why we have the lowest spending per capita in Canada, and we have a gutted revenue base to support
Mike
programs?
Harris said he wanted to make it so that no Ontario premier ever again could raise taxes. That was one of his missions, was to make the raising of taxes so impossible, so politically toxic that it could never happen again. Which, we can have the political ideological debate about that, but if you don't have revenue to run a jurisdiction, you don't have services, right?
Right. 25 years later, mission accomplished.
Yeah.
For Mike Harris, basically, right?
Yeah,
He has
exactly.
so far permanently shrunk the size of the Ontario government.
Yeah.
Right.
And it has been for his government, and then we had to continue in that mantra to a certain extent. A badge of honor to have the leanest spending government. That somehow that was a credit to our fiscal
It was part of our rhetoric.
Conservatism. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, well. So, was it worth it getting into elected politics? Did you look back on it? Was it worth it?
Absolutely.
Nobody took more slings and arrows than you, ever?
Not a question in my mind that it was worth it. Honestly. I cannot imagine a more fulfilling, a more rewarding, yes, a more challenging, but to have the opportunity to change people's lives in as profound a way as we did. Starting right from when I was first elected in 2003, and I was part of our women's caucus, and so it was a combination of women who were in cabinet and women who weren't. People like Deb Matthews, Monique Smith, and I were not in cabinet, but we were part of the women's caucus. And we made the case to our larger caucus that poverty reduction needed to be part of our agenda. We hadn't run on it, and there were people in the caucus who said, well, poor people don't vote for us. And then our response was, yeah, but there are many, many people who care about poor people who vote for us, and it's morally the right thing to do. So right from that point, right through to being a minister and being premier, I felt that we were doing things that were so critically important in people's lives.
And more so than you could have accomplished if you devoted the same amount of effort and energy to some other endeavor in life?
Well, I think, we need it all, right? People ask me that question. They will say, young people will say, should I stay outside of government or should I stay inside of government?
Yeah, what do you tell
Is
them?
it better to be in a community organization? I say we need both. So if this is what you want to do now, and if this is where your passion is now, staying at a community organization, that's fantastic, because government works best when it's constantly talking to people in the labor movement, in community organizations, in municipal government. That's how government policy, the best government policy, is made. So if we don't have good people talking to government, then we're in trouble. But at some point in your life, you may think that maybe sitting on the other side of the table would work, And I always say to young people, don't rule that out, because often the young people who are coming to me are really fascinated by politics and they like the idea, but they don't know how they would find themselves there. And so I think that doing what you care about, and whether it's inside or outside of government, is the best path to making a difference in people's lives.
How did it occur to you to run for provincial parliament? So you run for student council. You run for school board, and you lose.
Yeah.
And then what makes you think you should run for the legislature? So
there was a woman named Sheila Ward who organized Trudeau's campaign in '68 in Saskatchewan.
Right.
And then moved from...
This is a very important person in your life.
Very important person in my life. Sheila was... she was a rock for me. She was a school trustee for years, and one of the first times I ever spoke in a public political environment was I was speaking at the Toronto Board of Education. It would have been maybe 1992, and she was a school board trustee, and I was speaking about a group called Education Against Homophobia. So I'd been out for 2 years. She was a lesbian, and she came over to me afterwards, and she was really complimentary about how I'd spoken.
Right.
And I was quite taken aback. And, you know, she's died. She died in 2016. But I'm pretty sure she decided that she was going to groom me to be the premier that day. Because she was on me to think about running. She took me to Lynn McLeod's campaign, and I did some phone banking for Lynn McLeod. So Sheila really brought me to the Liberal Party in a way that nobody else did. So it was really Sheila who encouraged me. Once I was elected as school trustee in 2000, I was already on the path to being in partisan politics.
But without her intervention in that period of time, you might have drifted away.
Right, because she talked to me and taught me how the riding association system worked, you know, and we didn't always agree because she was a bit of an old school politician, you know.
Right. In what way?
Well, Sheila
where you draw that line,
rules.
because you and I have sometimes disagreed on where that line is.
Let's just say Sheila wasn't above bending the rules sometimes.
Excellent. A good LBJ politician.
Oh, yeah. No. She, you know.
Get it done.
Get her done. Exactly. And she was always very keen on me going into the office of whoever I was pissed off at the moment and tearing a strip off them. And I would say, Sheila, I don't think that's going to get me to where I need to go. So we didn't always agree on tactics, but we always agreed on where we wanted to be. And she just helped me enormously. And I miss her every day.
Yeah. Awesome. Upon reflection, how do you think that gender and sexual orientation affected your time in politics?
I was just saying to a group of actually older people today, we were talking about Elizabeth Warren and likability. And I think that in the same way that we still have misogyny in our society, there's misogyny in politics. Okay. And you and I and our team, we were always very careful not to ever use that or focus on it too much. I don't know the extent to which you guys talked about it in the back room and tried to solve for that or work around it. But I think that it helped to define how I could be with people, how I could be in the world, what I could wear, what I could say, how forceful I could be. I think it defined a lot of how we planned for our campaign and our work. Is Jane going to be in the picture or is she not going to be in the picture? Is Jane going to get off the bus with me or is she not going to get off the bus with me? You know, those were hard conversations for Jane and me to have. I had them with you and Andrew, and you reassured me and helped me through all of that, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Right.
And when I look back on it, David, I have to say, I kind of wish I had pushed back more. I kind of wish I'd found a way to be a bit more myself in some situations. Like I really did try to be myself wherever I was. I really did. But sometimes I think I deferred to a script or a formula when I probably shouldn't have. You know?
What's that, for instance?
Well, I think about a lot of the announcements that we made around energy or transit or, and I probably should have not taken notes. I probably should have spoken, how do you speak from your heart on transit? Well, there is a way to do that, and sometimes I would find my passion in it. But I think I was so busy and I tried to do so much that it was harder to go into those situations unscripted because I didn't want to make a mistake. And I'm not very good on remembering a whole lot of numbers and a whole, a litany of facts. And so I felt like
Which
I needed...
is the essence of political communications,
Yeah,
by the way.
I know.
Successful political
I
communication.
know.
Facts, numbers, data. Right?
I know.
Jesus.
And I let myself get sucked into that sometimes, you know, and I wish I could go back and not do that. I don't know what difference it really would have made, but I think that was a challenge.
Right. I know you like being in government. Do you like politics?
Well, I'm not in government now.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I am sitting in a very small third party, not even party status, opposition.
Don't rub it in.
No. Oh, freak, I'm sitting there. Rub it into you. I have to go in there every day. I love certain parts of it, even though I don't have any of the reins of power and I don't have a way to make a huge difference. I mean, I introduced a private member's bill the other week on fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. And I did a roundtable with stakeholders and, we talked about what needed to happen. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to debate it in the fall. So I love that part of politics. And I don't even know if that's the question you were asking, because you might have been asking, do I like the game of politics, the political maneuvering and the campaigning and that kind of stuff, which I also like. But what I really love is, okay, let's figure out, what is the next thing we should do to help kids with FASD? What is the next thing that we should do in our education system? How do we sort out? Today, for example, I was with seniors and we were talking about the continuum of care that people need. And so interesting, I was in a retirement home and one woman was saying, there are too many people who need too much care in this retirement home. They should be in a long-term care home. And I said to her, but you want to stay here the rest of your life, right? And she said, oh yeah, no, I want to stay here. And I said to the executive director, I said, okay, that's the essence of politics. Right? There it is. There it is. I want what I want when I want it. But anyway, so I love that part of it, David.
Right.
And I love campaigning. I don't particularly love the machinations. I don't love the vitriol. I don't love the viciousness that leads to people feeling excluded and people feeling disregarded. I don't like that. And I'm not saying that I'm always the most respectful person. I mean, I have my own vicious opinions about all sorts of things. I try not to attack people with them. And I just wish that we could have healthy, robust competition without slashing. I just wish we could do that. Social media's made that very hard.
So when you and I first met, you were very determined that you wanted to conduct politics in a more civil way,
right,
than had been conducted. And, in our relationship with me on the campaign, that came to a head over advertising and my profound belief in the power of negative advertising.
Right.
Right. But just in general, that was your approach to, and consistent with the way you conducted yourself beforehand. How do you think as premier and as party leader you managed the clash between your desire to be more civil and the inherent antagonistic pressures of modern social media-based politics, as you were suggesting?
I tried to not respond in kind. And sometimes that was
it would have been
very
almost
hard.
illegal for you to respond in kind to some of the things you said about you.
Yeah, exactly. But even when the press would come at me, because that was actually the manifestation, right? They would channel the crap that they heard on social media and then throw it at me, and I tried not to take the bait. Mm-hmm. And I had worked for years as a mediator, and I had learned to take hostile, angry situations and to try to diffuse them. And I had to call on all those skills as a political leader. And I don't know the degree to which I was successful, but that's what I tried to do. I tried to take a step back and not fall into what was easy for me because I have a temper, you know, and I'm quite volatile. If you talk to my children about
I don't have
lives,
to talk to anybody.
Right, you know that. So it's easy for me to get worked up.
Right.
I have to leave the house sometimes now. I have to leave the legislature because I respond. So what I tried to do as the leader was not get drawn into that and not respond in kind. Right. And that kept me sane, really. Because imagine if I'd gone into battle, guns blazing every day. Like, you'd burn out.
Yes.
You just burn out.
And you'd become really angry.
Yeah.
I mean, this makes you so... I mean, if you get into that politics at that... My biggest... Of all of the ways in which I failed you, my biggest failing was not recognizing that what was happening online was a concerted, organized, serious thing, and not getting on top of that early enough. And by the time we started to take it seriously, it had gotten away from us.
I mean, like the Ontario Proud stuff?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. But there was more than just that. But yeah.
Yeah, and to be fair to you and the team, I mean, it's not like that stuff had been around forever, right? No. They were learning, but their learning curve was fast, and we were in some ways the victims of that. I mean, there were lots of other things going on, David. We both know that.
Oh yeah,
we'd been there for 15 years.
Yeah,
right.
There's lots of, yes, I have no excuses.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You have exactly the same, you have access to exactly the same narrative around that as I do, which is we had been there for a very long time. You know, somebody said to me that our government shouldn't have won in 2011, and we won that minority. Mm-hmm. We certainly shouldn't have won in 2014, and there was not a chance in hell we were going to win in 2018. So that's what other people who have been in political backrooms have said to me. So you can only take so much responsibility.
You deserved a better campaign than you got, and we'll just leave it at that because we have a sponsor today. We have a sponsor. Queen's Park Today is sponsoring us, and they say, "Do you like politics? Dumb question. That's why you're here, isn't it?" So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or party politics, Queen's Park Today tells you what's going down in committee meetings, in question period, and on the ground. It lands in your inbox first thing every morning so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. Traditional media outlets are dying. The only way to really get the detailed, boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west, but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Okay, so let's talk legacy a little bit. We're not going to dwell on it, but let's talk legacy a little bit. You were both a cabinet minister and a premier, and when you look back, what are you most proud of having done? What are some of the initiatives that you're...
Yeah. So the first thing that I always think of when I'm asked that question, first of all, there isn't a single thing, right? There are a number of things. I am really proud of the work that we did in education. So I was Minister of Education from 2006 to 10. Yeah. And, I was there when we brought in full-day kindergarten. But the thing that I did that wasn't in our plan necessarily, but I knew was critical to our success as a government was I brought back the notion of equity and helping kids who were falling through the cracks as part of the student achievement agenda. That we needed to recognize that there were certain kids, certain populations that were not going to thrive if we didn't pay special attention to them, which is what equity means. And so we brought back an equity policy. And the reason that was so important was that Mike Harris had literally mandated that the word equity be taken out of all ministry documents. Like, they just eviscerated the all of the work that had been done by the NDP and Liberals before.
Is it allegedly in conflict with some commitment to excellence or something like that?
Equity?
Yeah.
Well, it was too left-wing. It was too soft, namby-pamby. Who knows? You get inside Mike Harris's head. I can't. But the important work that we did by then doing anti-bullying work and having an inclusive education policy really changed the way schools could work.
What's an inclusive education policy?
An inclusive education policy really is about having a vision for education that makes sure that all kids get an equal shot. So, for example, one of the initiatives we put in place was student success teachers, because there'd been a lot of teachers taken out of the system over the time that Harris was in office. So the way they defined a classroom was 4 walls and a ceiling, 1 teacher, and 30 kids in a class. We said no, there need to be other supports, and one of them was student success teachers. And what student success teachers do is they check on kids in grade 9. They see if they're accumulating their credits. They see how they're doing. They kind of lift them up at an early stage so that they can potentially graduate. Our graduation rate went from 68% in 2003 to like 86% by the time our government was finished. So that's a huge success. And it wasn't because we diluted the curriculum. It was because we gave supports to the kids who were perfectly capable but just needed a caring adult. So I'm really proud of that work. And that, to me, is what an inclusive education is about. Okay. And so that was in education. If I think about the rest of our time, I mean, in every...
Just wait, education, is that where you first connected with the Indigenous
yes,
issue
so that's,
in Ontario?
That's just what I was going to say. In each of my ministries, finding a way to support, do more work with Indigenous communities so that we could build a stronger relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that was really important to me. I mean, in transportation, for example, so I was shuffled to transportation in 2010. I got to transportation and I realized, here we are, we build roads in Ontario, all over the province, and we had no one whose job it was to make sure that as we sent engineers out to look at, and surveyors out to build those roads, we had no one whose job it was to connect with the First Nations communities or the Métis communities. Right. And that just, to me, seemed ridiculous. And so we put someone in place to make sure that happened. So those were the kinds of things.
Had you ever thought of the Indigenous issue before you went into politics?
Yes. 1978. 1978, I had just done the first year of my linguistics degree. I called the Department of Indian Affairs, as it was called at the time, and said, I'd like to volunteer this summer. Got anything you want me to do? They sent me, the woman's name was Mary Mitchell. She had been a missionary at one point. Anyway, she was working in the ministry. She sent me to Huron College in London, and I worked in an English as a second language program. And then she asked me to go to Hearst, to Constance Lake, which is north of Hearst, to do a language survey. And it was at the time when Ojibwe was just being kind of formalized, and they wanted to know whether it was Ojibwe or Cree that was being spoken on the reserve, because there was no school in the reserve at that time. The kids were going to school in Hearst, and they just didn't have a handle on what language was being spoken. And I lived on the reserve for most of that summer, the second month and a bit. And actually I wrote my thesis on the dialect of English spoken by those kids on that reserve, because what was happening was they were coming into town, into the school in Hearst, and the teachers had much lower expectations of those kids because of their language, because they thought their language was substandard. It wasn't substandard. It was just a different dialect of English because it was influenced by Ojibwe. Anyway, that's way more information
it's like thinking
that
a Cajun person is stupid or something like that for the same
reason. Right. And it's work that had been done on Black English in the United States. Anyway, so that experience, and I realized, David, that I was woefully inadequate. I actually, the next summer, went to Goose Bay, Labrador, and worked in a language program for Memorial University there. And both those experiences kind of exposed to me the truly horrible relationship that our government had with governments of First Nation people. And so I actually sort of took that with me, that experience with me into my political life.
Right. Okay. So beyond education, your time as education minister, is there anything in your time as premier that you look back on?
Yeah, well, I'm proud of so many things.
Well, I believe
I'm proud of so many things. So
let's go through.
So, the generations in this country are going to have better retirement security because we led that fight by saying we were going to, and by putting in place the beginnings of an Ontario retirement pension plan and then bringing along the country.
You called everybody's bluff.
Exactly. They didn't think we'd do it. And Harper wasn't interested in doing it. So I said, okay, we'll just do it here. And I was dead serious. And I said that to, there were some people in our caucus who were like, oh, well, we'll just pretend we're going to do this. I said, no freaking way. We are doing this. And if we're not real about it, nobody's going to believe us and it won't happen. And we were. And then when Trudeau was elected, we brought the country along. So I'm really proud of that. I'm very proud of our investments in infrastructure. When I was Minister of Transportation, I saw what was happening across the province. And so Dalton had started it, but we really upped the ante along with our climate change plan. It actually pains me physically that our cap and trade system has been destroyed,
Right.
It really, because it was so important, it was so elegant, and it was working. Dalton had done this great thing by shutting down the coal-fired plants, and he joined the Western Climate Initiative. And we came in and we implemented. We actually linked markets with California and with Quebec, and people were, industry was on side with us. I mean, they didn't love it, but they liked that it was a market mechanism.
When we explained it to them, thought it was so smart.
Exactly. So I'm so proud and devastated about that. I am, some of the things we did toward the end of the mandate, the second 2 years, raising the minimum wage. I wish we'd gone to $15, but, we made a decision. Right. I'm really proud of OHIP Plus. The fact is that the Tories they've weakened it. So the free pharma for kids, they've weakened it, and it's a real problem that some kids, because their parents have a plan, there are medications that are not covered anymore for them. But there are a whole lot more young people who are getting medication that they need because we put that in place. So those are really important things. I'm proud we did a basic income pilot.
You're a fan of universality, right?
I am.
I mean, my view is that it's the only thing that makes sure that these programs are high quality and sustainably funded is to make them universal. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. And I was convinced of that. Eric Hoskins made the argument very, very clearly and articulately. And as soon as it was put in place, we started to see the benefits of it. Honest to goodness, I would go into main streets and fathers would come up to me and say, you have changed my kid's life. You've changed our family's life because we can afford this medication. Yeah. So I'm incredibly proud of that. And the basic income pilot. I think because we put the basic income pilot in place in Ontario, it will happen again, or some version of the supports that were in place will happen in the future. Yeah. I think we let people see that it was possible, and the stories that came out of the basic income pilot where, people really were able to buy a truck or get some clothes so they could get a job. I mean, those changed people's lives and allowed them actually to work their way off social assistance. So I think at some point in the future, I was going to say an enlightened government, but a progressive government will look at that and will take a chance. I'm so afraid we're going to make the same mistake we just literally made, which is when the Western world got into these trade agreements, starting in the Canada-US and then NAFTA and then all the others, right? We devastated a certain type of job in the economy, just wiped it out, and didn't do anything for the people that had held those jobs or aspired to those jobs. And so now Donald Trump is the president of the United States, right? Yeah. And the technological revolution of AI is on us. about to wipe out, in the process of, frankly, and then en masse, about to wipe out so many, frankly, male jobs.
Right. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And men are already starting to fight back.
Yep.
This is a powder keg for me, watching this. And basic income is only one of the many ways in which you need to tackle that. But surely we're going to need to get our heads around that as we look at what the future of manual labor is.
Exactly. And the notion that giving people enough support so that they can take part in their community, so that they can work part-time or work for themselves, or they can be caregivers for a member of their family, which, you know, if you're a 55-year-old man, I mean, I've met lots of 55-year-old men who have family responsibilities. If they lose their jobs, they're in deep, deep trouble because it's tough to get another job. Right?
Yes, it is.
And so the basic income notion that we would have healthier, stronger communities if we could find a way just to give people that bit of a top-up, to me, made eminent sense. And, you know, this is not a capital L liberal idea. I mean, Hugh Segal kind of committed his political career to advancing this notion. And he was a progressive conservative, is a progressive
John
conservative.
Stackhouse sat in your very chair and argued with me that there was moral hazard to basic income because there was moral hazard to giving people money for nothing and how that would impact their own sense of self-worth and importance to society.
Well, so not having enough money to feed your kids, what's the impact of that on self-worth? You know, not being able to get your car on the road and being able to go to work because you don't have enough money. I just categorically reject that notion. I don't think anybody inherently wants to be inactive or in poverty. I think people want to be part of their communities. They want to be included and involved. And so, yeah, do we need to, along with the support, do we need to have a system of support? Because, you know, there are people who can get into the workforce, but they can't stay in the workforce, you know? And I've met a couple of people from the basic income pilot who have come and, you know, I've kept in touch with them. And they want to be able to touch base with someone. They want some feedback. They need a bit more than just, okay, here's the job, now stay in it. So I just don't buy that putting that kind of support in place for people is ultimately a bad thing. Are there some people who may not take full advantage of the supports and they may not do what John Stackhouse or somebody else thinks they should do? Maybe. But, you know, there are lots of people in the world who don't do the things that we think they should do. That's hardly a reason not to put in place a program that actually helps people stay in school, helps people get jobs, and helps people be part of their community.
Right. I've heard you say in speeches that the world isn't fair.
Right.
Whoever told you it ought to be?
I don't know. I think it's part of what I believe we're here to do is to try to make it as fair as we can. I think I learned early on that it wasn't, having a very ill sister, and you know, she couldn't keep up with the kids around her. But I guess I've always held the notion that let's at least try to make it as fair as possible, as a kind of pillar of my belief system. I don't know whether that comes from my faith. I don't know whether it comes from having been brought up in the church. I don't know. Probably. It's probably part of that.
Right. How did it guide you how did it guide you? There's two things I think about as principles that you articulated. One was this notion of fairness, and the other was the notion of the activist center. And I'm interested in how both or either one of those helped guide you through decision making.
Yeah, so I think the fairness, that's sort of the underpinning of what I believe we should be trying to do in political life, you know? People who have had every advantage.
So that's different, for example, from wanting the economy to grow as fast as possible.
Right.
Right.
Those are all means to ends for me. The end is having a society where people have a shot at having a decent life. Everybody has a shot at having a decent life. For me, that's the end. You know, a thriving economy, a balanced budget, a particular program, those are all means to that end. And so the fairness is, for me, the kind of underpinning of what we're trying to achieve. The activist center is kind of, that's where the if there's an ideology, that's where the ideology lives and the tactics come from, right? So, okay, how are we going to make this happen? You know, I'm going to look for ideas from wherever on the political spectrum, and then I'm going to try to implement them. And I want to do something. I don't want to just talk about it. I want us to find the way to solve this problem as it presents itself.
What does the word center mean in activist center? Like somebody with your interests and your concerns, you could easily, no, that's the wrong way to put it, might easily have been a New Democrat. Why are you not a New Democrat?
I'm not a New Democrat because I cannot tie myself as rigidly to an ideology. I mean, our last election is a perfect example of that, David.
Right.
And I still get yelled at by the NDP about the issue of back to work legislation, right? Yeah. You know, when I said...
because that's their convenient excuse about why they lost the election.
Right. But, you know, it illustrates the point, which is, you know, when Andrea Horwath said she could not imagine a time that she would ever use back to work legislation, to me, that's the definition of why I'm a Liberal and not an NDPer. Because sure, I don't believe in back to work legislation in the sense that it's part of my credo. Wouldn't
it be great to use that one day?
Honest to God, yeah. Like it's not like I'm slathering at the idea of using back to work legislation. But in a pragmatic world, when you get to a point where you've tried every other bloody thing, then you might have to use back to work legislation. But if you're an NDPer, you don't have that tool in your toolkit, and that's ridiculous to me. So that's why I'm not an NDPer. And you know, as far as being a conservative, well, that was never an option for me, because I really always felt that the pursuit of a better life for people who already had a really good life was not what politics was about. That wasn't what I was interested in.
Right. There are a couple of things I want to talk to you about from that legacy, from that period. One of them is Hydro One and the sale of Hydro One. Because it, first of all, I don't know what you think, but I do not believe that's what lost us the election at all. But it did seem to be the thing that you did that was most off-brand for your supporters, that puzzled to alienated people as a decision. What was your thinking behind doing that?
She sighs. You know, I struggled with that decision for weeks. I had made this strong commitment to investment in infrastructure, and I really believed in it, David. I felt so strongly that we were far behind in terms of transit. Dalton had made a start, but we had to have the capacity to keep funding the build. That was essentially it. I'd seen bridges all over the province that were falling down. Like, I knew the infrastructure it wasn't that it was failing, but that it was rough and it needed to be fixed. So we needed money to do that. And we were borrowing. We kept borrowing until the finance folks were saying to us, the bond rating agencies are going to look askance at this. You know, they are going to...
Even though the money was going into infrastructure. Even
though it was going into infrastructure, they were going to say your borrowing should come to an end at some point, or you need some more liquidity in order to borrow against, right? You need something that demonstrates that you've got some cash that allows you to continue to borrow. So that was why we asked Ed Clark. Now, you know, I didn't spend my life on Bay Street. I I didn't have those contacts, but I believed that, as in all things, you can get the smart people to come in and help you. And so he put together a team of smart people. We said, we need to find a way to generate some cash so that we could continue to build. And he looked at OLG, he looked at OPG, so he looked at the lottery and gaming, he looked at the Liquor Control Board, he looked at Ontario Power Generation, and he looked at Hydro One. I think OLG came off the table pretty early, but he looked at those others and then came back to us with a recommendation. And the recommendation was that the transmission part of the electricity system, so Hydro One, not the generating part, and this is where I'll come back to that in a second, but the transmission part.
You're unlikely to sell the nuclear reactors. But
exactly. But the NDP conflated what we did with that. You know, they pretended that we had sold off the wind or the water and the nuclear. Yeah. Anyway, we hadn't. It was transmission. And it was already mixed. There was already public and private in the transmission system. And I thought, I guess, naively, that because we were not doing what Harris did with the 407, we weren't just selling off an asset to put the money on the bottom line and carry on. We were actually selling off part of an asset to invest in another asset. I thought I could explain that to people. And I can now, apparently. I met with, students just a few weeks ago, and we had a really robust discussion, and they all at the end said, you did the right thing, but that's not what the people of Ontario said.
Yeah, well, it's very hard. People are so cynical about where the money goes. It's very hard to convince people that it was going right back into infrastructure.
I know, and they, people couldn't draw that direct line, so the money's sitting in an account essentially, and we're building transit. But why isn't $1 billion a year going out of that account to build? Because it doesn't work that way, because it takes time, because you're paying for this contract and that contract and you're borrowing against that money. I mean, it's complicated financing.
Well, you are dealing with a population where 38% of the population is avoiding Corona beer because they don't want to get the coronavirus.
I know,
so explaining some of these issues is a bit difficult.
Yeah, but you know what, David? I don't actually think of it that way. I take it on myself and think, if I'd found a way to explain it better, I wish I think people could have understood it, but I didn't find that way. I couldn't find it.
So I don't really believe that it was only because the finance people told you about the bond raters, because you and I really kind of quarreled about the role of about the size of the deficit.
Yeah.
From the time that we met each other and started talking about political strategy and and government. And
so you're saying because I wanted to balance the budget.
Well, nobody will ever believe this, but you ran a restrained government.
I know.
Right? You took the deficit from over $11 billion in the year you took office to under $4 billion in the last full year of your time. Nobody will ever believe that, but we'll just say it on here for the record.
To be fair, I increased the deficit when I came into office. We increased the deficit that first year, and in order to invest in infrastructure, and we raised taxes on high income earners. So yeah, I did want to balance the budget.
Right. There's a core responsibility ethic to you, right? About this, you just didn't like. I kept telling you, nobody cares politically. Do not worry about this.
Right. And
you still cared.
Well, yeah, I do. I do care.
Yeah.
I do care because I think it, this from the man who was in Paul Martin's office.
No, I know.
Really, yeah. Somebody around you cared too. I did care about it. I felt we'd made a commitment. We were on we had a plan that we'd put in place under the previous government. I think the other thing, David, was that we'd taken that hit in 2008, 2009. The economy really had taken such a hit in Ontario. And I believe that part of the optimism that we were trying to build back into Ontario was that we could dig out of that hole.
Right, okay,
right?
yeah.
So the deficit, it wasn't the deficit that was the problem. It was are we going to be okay? It was the shakiness of manufacturing. It was the auto sector.
Yeah.
And are we going to be all right? And part of the signal that we were going to be all right was staying on track to balance the budget. And so again, it was in a way part of that whole message to the people of the province is this is a great place to be. This is a great place to run a business, and it's a great place to live.
And in the same way as Tommy Douglas, you're kind of a, let's expand the social safety net, but let's pay our way as we go.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Right?
Sheila Ward always wanted me reading Tommy Douglas's speeches. Yeah. you Saskatchewan people, but he was wonderful.
Tommy Douglas. Yeah, to just tell you a story about Tommy Douglas. One of my great mentors in politics was a guy named Davy Stewart, who had been the leader of the party and he was the president and chief organizer of the party when Ross Thatcher finally defeated the NDP after 20 years in government in Saskatchewan. And flash forward, Davy's a member of the Senate, and Tommy Douglas dies. And nobody who's in the Senate has ever spent 20 years fighting Tommy Douglas door to door in Saskatchewan. So they're standing up and they're extolling the genius of this guy and the greatness of this man. And Davy's just sitting in his chair listening to all these speeches, right? And finally somebody stands up and says, Tommy Douglas didn't have an enemy in the world. And Davy Stewart can't take it. And he stands up, he says, point of order, Mr. Speaker, I was his enemy.
That's great. There has been a deification. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Besides policy, do you think that the bully pulpit, the platform of being premier, allowed you to change the province in other ways?
Well, I think just by virtue of being a woman and being a lesbian in that office has changed people's perspective on what's possible. I mean, I know that there are families in this province who believe their daughter or their gay child can do things that they didn't believe before I was the premier. So that's a pretty fundamental change, and I think it is real.
It's helpful that people deny that you were in part defeated because you were a woman and gay. So it allows that story of hope to fully exist.
Exactly.
Right? It's not like, holy Christ, that really came back to haunt her. Right?
Yeah. No, I think so. I think.
Did you use language? Did you use speeches? Did you use where the premier went? How the premier looked? Did you consciously use the job to change the province a little bit, or change the way the province looked at itself or thought about itself?
Well, I think just by virtue of the things that I could do because of who I was, you know. I mean, I think the amount of time I spent in schools and the conversations that I could have with young people, the work that we did in violence against women, and the positioning of that issue, and the way we took it on during the sort of young Rameshi stuff. You know, and I
mattered to a lot of people.
And I was really, really worked up about that. I was really mad. I was mad the way the media was treating it like it was a big freaking surprise, you know? And that was what I said to my staff. Like, we've got to do something here, because this is being treated as though they've just discovered that men harass women, or they sexually assault women, you know? And I brought together a group of students, and we basically worked with the bureaucused to put a policy in place and do that ad. We did an ad that was
very
used
powerful
across, used across the country. So yeah, I used that office in a number of ways to advance issues that I believe wouldn't have been advanced otherwise. And I had male colleagues say to me, this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been there. If it hadn't been, as I always said, the grandmother's running the place. You know, it just wouldn't have happened.
Unfortunately, you can still be running for president and say, well, I guess the women didn't like the jokes I told. That's what Bloomberg said.
I know he did. I know.
Yeah.
It's just painful.
Yeah.
He's out now.
Yes, he is out now. So let's quit reminiscing and let's start talking about the world as it is.
Yeah.
today. And I got to start with the teacher strike. You, I believe, operated on a sort of a net zero compensation principle when you were premier. So you were negotiating agreements without giving compensation increases. How did you manage to keep labor peace? And what's the way out of this mess that we're in right now?
Well, you know, we didn't have 100% labor peace, as the current minister will be happy to tell you, but we certainly had a good working relationship. And you know, we weren't negotiating net zero the whole time. I mean, there were some increases. There were increases to benefits. And it comes down to relationship. It comes down to respect. I mean, I always had, as the Minister of Education, as the Premier, I always had a way to have a conversation with somebody in the leadership. I always had, I mean, I had them on my cell phone. You know, we were able to talk, and those relationships got us through because I understood and valued what was happening in the classrooms, and I understood that teachers work very hard for the dollars that they earn. Whereas, you know, you've got a situation now where the Premier and the Minister denigrate teachers. The Premier and the Minister, both of whom earn more than teachers, and talk about how teachers earn $90,000 a year and it's a lot of money. I just, you know, it's so disrespectful. I also believe in the labor movement. You know, I believe that the labor movement has created, to a large degree, our civil society. Right. And so I was never interested in undermining that. And that is that's just a position that's a stance that I took. And so everything I did came out of that. So when Liz Sandals, you know, when we were in trouble trying to get a deal, I brought the labor leaders in and we had a conversation about how we were going to get to the end, because I was not interested in a fight. I wanted to find an agreement. And I think that is just the antithesis of what we have today. I think this is a government that does want to fight. I think that they've now been shamed into backing down on class size and on the other ridiculous issues, the mandatory online learning, you know. But those policies, I mean, this is the other thing, David. Those policies that the government has put forward came from no consultation. They came from no evidence. They were written on the back of a napkin. They're not part of a coherent vision of what education is about. Whereas what we were constantly trying to do was put together a coherent strategy for improving the education system, you know, and by improving, I mean, yes, doing better in terms of international comparisons, but doing better in terms of kids who are falling behind and doing better in terms of getting kids into post-secondary. Like, we had metrics that we were targeting and we were hitting for the most part.
Right. The government's completely wrong on this thing. They should just stand down.
Yeah, they should just stand down because there's no argument for increasing class size. They don't need the money. They've inflated the budget. Their revenues are up. They don't need the money. And taking adults out of the schools makes no sense. You've got more kids with more severe needs in the schools. You've got kids who are being asked to prepare for an economy that we don't even understand, and so they need the support of the adults in the schools. So they don't need that. The issue around online learning, the government's saying it's about learning about technology. That's not what it's about. It's about taking more money out of the system because you can staff those.
Yeah, for sure.
Classes high, with more kids. Anyway, so yeah, they should stand down. And what we know from
I would never have found a way around that as a kid. Never have found a way around online learning.
Yeah. You invented it, right? Distance learning. Exactly. He's out there somewhere learning. But what we know from other jurisdictions is that it doesn't work. It works for the kids who do well and are self-motivated, but it doesn't work for the kids who are not, who are exactly the kids who are most at risk. So it's just bad policy.
Okay. The country has been embroiled for several weeks now in a discussion, might be too sophisticated a word for it, about the intersection of resource development, environmental protection, and Indigenous reconciliation. Well, let me just start. What are your thoughts as to how that whole thing unfolded?
I believe that the Prime Minister and his ministers are doing the right things now. I personally might have wished that it was more visible earlier, because I don't think nothing was happening right from the beginning. I mean, I think there's always been a conversation going on.
Even when he was in Africa.
Even when he was in Africa. Yeah, I mean, this notion that somehow he needed to come back from Africa for it to, whatever. That's an optics thing.
Yeah.
But I do believe that it should have been more visible earlier what was happening, right? This is what we're doing. This is the plan. This is who's talking to whom. But I think essentially what the government is doing is what needs to be done. There needs to be the continuation of a very difficult conversation around all those things you talked about, whether it's resource revenue sharing, whether it's the environmental protections, or whether it's, getting resources to Tidewater. I mean, those are the pieces of the conversation. I think where we get into trouble is when we believe that this can happen quickly, that somehow there's a magic solution here. And there isn't. We've talked about reconciliation in this country a lot, and it's going to take a long time. And that's the painful reality. So we better figure out how to have some ongoing, serious, preventative discussions as we try to develop resources to the benefit of everyone in the country, because it's not just about BC. We're having the same conversations in Northern Ontario about the Ring of Fire. We've got to have some trust built up, and I think that's what the government's doing. It did.
Right? The negotiations and discussions. Yeah. You, in the 2014 election platform, in the Liberal platform, you put $1 billion on the table for development of the Ring of Fire.
Right.
And you couldn't get anybody to spend $1 of it.
Right. But we got there, David. By the end of just before the election, it took all that time, and it took the last 2 years of really intense conversation with the Matawa First Nation chiefs. There are 9 of them. And Bob Ray was part of that discussion as the interlocutor for the First Nations. Frank Yakabuchi was working as an interlocutor for the government. I was there with my 2 ministers, Michael Gravel, Northern Development, and David Zimmer, Indigenous Relations. And we did get to the point where Webequie and Martin Falls and Nabitimek were ready to make an agreement with us on building a road. We didn't have all 9, and the conversation would have continued, but at least we got to the point where we could start thinking about building a road. And part of that was because we had, in the course of those 2 years, we'd established a table that was talking about jurisdictional rights and permitting, so some things that were different than just the building of the road. And we were talking about environmental protections. So all those things come together in every one of these conversations. You can never just talk about, what's the construction plan for the road? That's not enough. It's got to be, how do we make sure that these other issues that are going to be raised, like we've got 9 communities, are those 9 communities going to get jobs out of this? Is there going to be a training opportunity? Are we going to make sure that what happened in Grassy Narrows with Domtar doesn't happen again in terms of spoiling the water? Those conversations are all part of any resource development, any economic development in the North.
I'm going to ask you a question that may seem a bit rough, but I think it's an important question for more people than we might like. What right do these people have to stop any of this?
We made we made promises.
Who's we?
We, everybody except Indigenous people, everybody who's come here as a European, all the people who came after, we made a pact, and they're called treaties. You know, they were the contract we made with First Nation people, that we would share, that we would be fair, that we would respect their sovereignty on certain parts of the land, and we have not lived up to that. And yes, there are parts of the country that aren't under treaty. I understand that. But I would say as a society, we made a contract that we've broken over and over and over again. And the people who have paid the price for that are the generation after generation of Indigenous people. And, you know, if we don't accept that intergenerational trauma from residential schools, from kids being taken from their homes, from people being relegated to nasty pieces of land that have no potential for economic development, if we don't accept the intergenerational trauma of that, then we can't actually have a conversation about reconciliation. Because at the root of reconciliation is an understanding that that relationship got broken very early, and it's not that we're rebuilding it, it's that we're actually building it. And that's at the root of this. And I know, I mean, I listened to the all the voices talking about the police should go in and they need to move people off the block. And I mean, I understand where that comes from in terms of the visceral frustration. And I also understand that, you know, we have to keep people safe. But what I think the other side of it is that if we don't have a trusting enough relationship that we can talk through these issues, then we are going to keep having this kind of disruption.
But who's we? Most white Canadians do not accept any of the principles that you laid out, right? They don't accept any of the principles you laid out. If I look at the polling I've done over the years, I can tell you that most people think that the treaties are historical artifacts, not contracts, that people think that First Nations people are advantaged, not disadvantaged. They're advantaged by no taxes. They're advantaged by free post-secondary education, a number of different things, and their societies are not considered to be equal. And so the notion that they have a right to live a different way, most people in Canada don't accept that. So if we're actually going to build a consensus around those ideas in Canada, we are so far from that. That is an elite consensus that has been dropped on the country. And when something like this happens, that's exposed for what it is. Nobody actually believes that stuff.
Well, that you may be right. I'm sure you are right. I know you're a good pollster, and you're probably absolutely right. But it's like, we don't have a choice, David. We've got to figure this out. You know, we've got to figure this out, because if we want to continue to grow, and if we want a labor force in Northern Ontario, just to be really practical, if we want a labor force in Northern Ontario, we better figure out how to support Indigenous kids. We better figure out how to make sure that they live in communities where they can thrive, because otherwise, you talk to businesses in Kenora, you talk to the mayor of Sioux Lookout. If we don't do that, then the kids who are growing up there, if they don't have those advantages, they're going to be a burden that those communities have to carry, you know? And so I don't think we have an option but to, I mean, in the crassest political sense, I don't think we have any option but to figure this out. Indigenous kids are the fastest growing segment of the population in the province.
Right.
So we've got to find a way to make sure that they're participating in the economy. And if what we do is continue to alienate their parents and their grandparents, if we continue to disbelieve the reality of a contract that was put in place, or if we disregard the notion of intergenerational trauma that actually affects kids.
I think that's one of the hardest things for people to understand is, why did things that happened 50 years ago have any impact today? Right?
So when you say I'll give you an example. A family is living on the James Bay coast, and in 1956, a little girl who's 4 is put in a boat and taken across Georgian Bay to Quebec, to Chisasibe, and that's where that little girl goes to school until she's 12 or so. She's like 4 or 5 years old or 6 years old. She's taken across. She can't speak her language. She's in a church school. She has to become a Catholic or an Anglican, whichever it is. She loses contact with her family. And when she goes back, she doesn't speak Cree the way they speak Cree anymore. She's not hugged at night. Nobody kisses her. Nobody looks after her. Nobody teaches her how it feels to be loved. And then she grows up and she has a couple of kids, and she's pretty depressed because her life has been torn apart and she doesn't really understand where she fits at all. And so she drinks, from time to time, or maybe a lot, depending. She tries really hard to raise her kids, and she does the best job that she can. But she doesn't hug those kids. She doesn't read to the kids at night. She doesn't kiss them goodnight because she may have been abused in that residential school too, because thousands of kids were abused in that school. So the whole nurturing of that next generation is kind of lost because the mom who was ripped out of her home doesn't know. And then those kids who she raised, they go on and have kids. And maybe that generation, so maybe in 2006 or 7, those kids marry someone who has been nurtured and does know how to parent. And maybe then that kid can learn how to parent a little bit. But that's 2 generations that have been damaged by what happened. So that's how intergenerational trauma works, because you learn what you learn from your environment. And if your environment abuses you, then you pass that on to the next generation. And then you either produce kids who are survivors or not, right?
Right.
And there are a lot of kids who have fallen through the cracks because of that kind of history. And so, the right wing in this country can either accept that or not. But it is real. And if they choose not to accept it, then it just means the rest of us have to work even harder to build those trusting relationships. And, I think that there are people who are willing to do that, not in a superficial way. I mean, I always did land acknowledgements when I became the premier because I had done it when I was a minister. And I know now people are very dismissive of land acknowledgements and they don't mean anything and whatever. But honestly, 20 years ago, nobody did a land acknowledgement. Nobody even thought about it. It never crossed anyone's mind.
It was jarring to me when you were doing it.
Well,
at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because I hadn't heard it before. Wasn't used to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the only reason I wanted to do it, well, there are 2 reasons. One is out of respect. But the second reason was I wanted to jar you. I wanted to jar anyone who hadn't thought that there was somebody here before us and that we had some responsibility. I'll just give you one more reason we need to do this. I honestly believe, David, that it's not that long ago that people in Indigenous communities saved us from the environment. They literally saved Europeans when we arrived here. They just freaking knew more about what was going on in the land. And when I went to Attawapiskat, and I went to Kasheshewan, and I heard stories from some of the elders about where the pipes were laid, for the water coming out of James Bay. And I heard elders say, well, we told them this was the wrong place to put it. It's the land's too low. They should have put it over here. And now we got all this silt in our water and we've got flooding. And, we didn't listen. And I just think, why don't we try listening? there's a group of people in Pekanjikam who have been working with the Ministry of Natural Resources on a reforestation and forest health project for years. I think it's called White Feather. And they're teaching the Ministry of Natural Resources folks about the traditional ways of preserving the forest. Well, why wouldn't we try to learn some of those things? Like, goodness knows we need that information now in 2020. So why wouldn't we try to learn from them?
Well, it's so heavily discounted because it's not scientific.
But it's not that it's not scientific. We just don't understand it.
Right?
Maybe it worked for millennia. And maybe there's some science that we haven't figured out. I don't know. I think there are a whole lot of reasons that we're going to have to do this. But the most practical one is that who wants to have this fight? Really, do we want this fight? And I found it very scary what was being said when those blockades were going on, The notion that somehow the Prime Minister should direct the police or the Premier should direct the military or the police to go in and shoot people? What exactly was the instruction that they thought should be given? So I think the police and the military have handled themselves very, very well.
Yeah.
Because they actually understand the realities of the relationship and the importance of it.
Really quickly, I want to ask you what you think about the U.S. election. First of all, the field has narrowed considerably.
Yeah.
Are you Sanders or Biden?
I'm Warren.
Yeah, we're all Warren.
I'm so disappointed, David.
How did you feel watching your campaign?
Well, I felt worried when it had that dip. And then I thought, when she was doing the pinky fingers and she was doing all that stuff, it seemed like she was really connecting again. Yeah. And I thought, this is going to work. Something's going to happen here. So I just have to tell you, I'm really disappointed that we've got two septuagenarian white men. And and then we got Trump.
Right.
So I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in it. But I think Biden has a better shot at beating Trump. That's
because
how
he's
I
more
see it.
centrist?
Because he's more centrist. I think that he can capture more of the middle vote than
Which one do you think is most likely to live till November?
I think Bernie's more vital, quite frankly.
Heart attack or not, he still looks...
He'll just live on adrenaline.
Yeah. Kathleen, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me. I feel like I just talked way too much. But anyway,
it was so much fun. And I love you, eh?
Yeah, well, the feeling's mutual. Feeling's mutual.
It probably was a hindrance as a campaign manager because you're not supposed to fall in love with your candidate, but I did.
Or vice versa.
So thank you. I want to thank all the people responsible for putting this on. I want to thank the Orange Lounge for hosting us. I want to thank Andy for the video and Metal for the audio production and the Air Quotes Media team behind us. And, of course, our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for their ongoing financial support to the podcast. Next week, we'll be back with the Read and Burn political panel.
There'll be more swearing again.
There will be more swearing and a lot less thoughtful erudition.
You guys are smart.
Thank you all for tuning in. Till next week.